Robbie Forgotten, Chapter 11. Robbie could not see, hear, or do anything as he plunged into the earth, shuttled at an alarming speed down the treacherous chute. Everything streaked by black and blue around him, and his ears were filled with the deafening rush of displaced air from his rapid descent. Even as he sensed the chute curving this way and that, his momentum kept him going like a pinball in an arcade. He was helpless to stop it, twisting and turning, hurtling through the pipe until it all came to an abrupt end and he was spat out into open air. Robbie tumbled clear of the chute into a free fall and then... whoomph! Something unexpectedly big and soft caught him, skidding a few feet across the floor with the force of his landing. It took some time for Robbie's stomach to drop out of his throat and his heart to slow from an out-of-control jackhammer to merely a racing percussion. Only when his body had caught up with the rest of his senses that he was grounded again was he able to open his eyes and comprehend what it was he'd landed on. A big furry recliner? What? The question crept out under Robbie's breath. What just happened? For a moment Robbie sat paralyzed, not daring to move from his seat. Surely someone had heard his rather inelegant arrival. The metal chute was only now just ceasing its resonating echo. It made his ears ring as he strained to listen, but there was nothing to hear. He was left in a suffocating silence. There were just a few dim reserve lights on, high overhead in the crossbeams that made up the ceiling, casting only the gloomiest illumination. All around Robbie were dark and looming shadows that could be hiding anything. He struggled up out of the recliner and groped around with mounting panic as he gathered that he had fallen into a very deep, very big place. "Hello?" he tried calling, both wanting and not wanting anyone to answer him, but he was very much alone, and his voice was swallowed up in the cavernous chamber. Everything was so cold, he unconsciously wrapped his arms around himself in response to the chill. The floor was hard like concrete under his shoes, and every step he took caused a sharp echo to bounce off all the metal. Immediately in front of him was some sort of large platform, an intimidating centerpiece amidst all the vaguely threatening shapes encroaching on every side. Robbie clambered up the steps and across the grating to find what had to be some kind of control panel taking up most of the floor space on the catwalk. Maybe he could turn on a few more lights this way? There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to how the buttons, dials, and knobs were arranged. It looked like even an electric keyboard had been riveted directly onto the console. Robbie threw caution to the wind and tried haphazardly to get anything to happen, punching keys and flipping switches indiscriminately. His efforts were rewarded by the thrumming of generators kicking on, and the clicking and blinking of more lights sputtering to life and casting the large space in even more daunting relief. He wished it was dark again. To call it an underground house would be generous. It made no sense, but there were full-length windows along one of the far walls, looking more like terrible glaring faces with their warped frames and streaked-over panes. There was nothing good to see through them either, but the vague and discomforting emptiness of the surrounding cave in which the bunker was housed. Besides the recliner, which Robbie now could see was an off-putting shade of orange, there was little else in the place that offered anything in the way of color or comfort. All surfaces were concrete and steel in hard metallic shades. There were no plants, no pictures on the walls. Heaps and piles of scrap metal lay everywhere, especially around a long workbench and the large table on which were scattered a variety of mallets, saws, and soldering equipment. It was a scene of destruction and invention, but the nature of those inventions could not be very good if the rest of the environment was anything to go by. More machinery chugged and whirred noisily alive right beside Robbie, nearly making him jump off the catwalk but for the ramp that caught him. Powerful beams like flood lamps flashed on in quick succession down the platform in a lineup. For each one of these spotlights an enormous glass tube was illuminated from the inside out, and inside of them... Robbie clutched tight to the ramp as he stared in abject horror at the terrible things inside those tubes. A menacing dinosaur with razor-sharp teeth. A tremendously scary snow monster. A billowing and ghastly ghost. And on down the line, the strangest and most frightful visages he'd ever seen before. All but for what stood in the last tube, down at the very end. They were just mannequins wearing costumes, not real creatures. The understanding was not exactly reassuring, but filled Robbie more with a dreadful curiosity than outright fear. Without realizing it, he had crept closer, needing to look at what was in that last case. The dummy on display in there looked strangely familiar. It was just about his height. It even had a wig styled like his hair, and its clothing. It was dressed up in the exact same purple-striped suit as he was. Robbie backed away from the tubes and nearly toppled over the railing again. He caught himself and strode down the ramp in a hurry, looking around desperately for a clearly marked exit, but all he could see were horrible-looking machines, cobbled-together contraptions, harsh steel and sharp edges. Everything was so grim down here, so dark and gritty and uninviting, nothing like the rest of the town overhead. Come to think of it, Sportacus's airship had been very different from LazyTown too, so advanced and polished and sleek, equipped to suit a hero's needs. But this place... Something rumbled and banged over Robbie's head, booming like thunder. He dove behind the recliner to take cover and waited to see what was coming next. Or who. Sportacus flew out of the chute and landed nimbly on his feet. He looked around with plain concern at his surroundings. "Robbie, are you in here?" The elf's scanning eyes spied Robbie peeking out from behind the chair, and a look of relief washed over his face. He moved towards him. "There you are, Robbie. Thank goodness. I was looking everywhere. I was worried." Sportacus paused before reaching him. He glanced around them and looked back at Robbie. "Did you just find this place?" Sportacus asked, a hint of caution in his voice. "It was an accident," Robbie said. He straightened up slowly from behind the recliner. "Sportacus, I think—" Sportacus tensed ever so slightly, shifting his stance. Robbie, too, started to frown, his own face twitching like he was fighting a headache. He looked at Sportacus in a strange way. "This is my home," Robbie said quietly. "Isn't it?" "I think so," Sportacus confirmed just as quietly. "You remember, then?" Robbie's brow creased deeply, and the frown pulled harder on the corners of his mouth, turning it into a grimace. "No!" he spat out, the word loaded with frustration for that question, always that question. "I almost remember remembering, but then I don't remember. I can't! I just can't!" "I'm sorry," was all Sportacus could say. "I can't believe that I would live here," Robbie said, flinging an arm about themselves in a choppy and irritated fashion. "This isn't a home, it's a lair! It's horrible and dark and cold and—" Robbie's hands balled up into fists, and he clenched his teeth so hard that the cords stood out in his neck. "And everyone else lives in nice houses up there, and you've got your fancy airship. Everyone knows where you live," Robbie growled, his voice rising with every word. "They never yell at you or call you names. You're LazyTown's superhero. Does that mean that I—" The words caught in his throat, staunching the flow of his outburst momentarily. He tried to force it out. "I'm—" His knuckles bulged white and his fists trembled, and the tremble ran all the way up his arms and made his shoulders hunch and shiver. Sportacus broke free of his own tension and strode around the armchair to attend to the shaking man. "You," Sportacus said, "are my best friend." He slipped an arm lightly around Robbie's shoulders, ready to draw back at the slightest shrug or push should the comfort be rejected. "You don't have to be anything else, Robbie, that you don't want to be." Robbie went rigid at the weight of Sportacus's arm, his breath halting with a strangled gasp. He turned jerkily towards the hero with his face screwed up and growing redder by the second. Sportacus quickly retracted his reach and started to back off. But Robbie didn't push him away. He flung his arms around Sportacus and pulled him into a hard hug. Sportacus stood arrested by the ungraceful embrace. Automatically his arms came up and around Robbie, patting him gently on the back. A few full-body shudders racked the taller man's frame, and his breathing hitched over and over again, but he was otherwise silent. They stood like that for who knew how long. Seconds that stretched into minutes, minutes that felt like hours, until finally Robbie was no longer shaking and he relaxed his grip, releasing Sportacus carefully. Their eyes met before Robbie could look away. He saw in the hero's face no anger or disgust, but simple acceptance and only a lingering quirk of concern. Robbie's whole face was a bit more haggard for the exchange, but his eyes were dry, if a little red. He shuffled around to the front of the recliner and sat down heavily in it. Sportacus paced slowly around the chair and let the man be quiet. They both needed a moment. "Do I have to stay down here by myself now?" Robbie asked after a time, looking up at Sportacus. By the wavering line of his mouth and the deep furrow in his brow, it was clear he didn't want to. "No," Sportacus said, "of course not." He held out his hand to the villain. "Come on, let's get out of here."